Well, hello everybody and welcome back. We are going to move on to chapter 3, looking a little bit at the history of special education. Um, the history, really isn't all that old if we look upon it. Um, but as we begin, let's look at a couple key people that are integral in teaching kids with students with disabilities. First of all, we look at who has been named the father of special education, Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard. He was a French physician. He actually had no university training and worked at a bank. Well, then he entered the army during the French Revolution and actually presented himself as a physician and learned his trade there, worked alongside different surgeons, and then later, after being dismissed from the army, he continued to work as a physician. He primarily worked with patients who were deaf and mute and was known as the educator of the deaf. Then he is probably best known for working with the wild boy of Evryon, who was an 11-year-old boy who was found running naked and wild in the woods in southern France. This boy had had no exposure to civilized society. So when he was found, many people said, "Oh, this child is unteachable. He, can't talk and can't do a lot of those developmental things that 11-year-olds should." Although Itard did not believe them. He felt like he could make a difference in this little boy's life. So he gave him a name, named him Victor, and began working with him. So he was one of those first people that created an individualized program, what we call today an IEP, for Victor. He eventually actually adopted Victor. He didn't make as much progress with him as he had hoped, but still made progress. Itard was also one of those first people to instruct children with those cognitive disabilities in kind of a scientific way. So you can see how he kind of led the way back in the late 1700s, 1800s for what we call special education today. Another person that is key in what special education is today is Annie Sullivan Macy. So back in the mid 1800s into the 1900s, she was an American teacher who was most famous for working with Helen Keller, who was a girl who was blind and deaf. So Annie herself has suffered from an eye disease called trachoma that eventually, in her life left her blind. There was a point in time where she attended in Boston the Perkins School for the Blind and then was able to get some treatment and some surgeries to improve her vision. But by the time she was older, she really was left blind from this condition. But through her time at the School for the Blind, she really learned a lot and kind of had that love for teaching. So the Helen Keller's family went to this school and was looking for someone who could teach their daughter. So they suggested Annie Sullivan for this job. So this kind of began a 49-year relationship between these two, which started out as the teacher-student relationship. She also took care of her as her governess, and then eventually in life they became companions and then friends in the end. What Annie Sullivan did is she really took Helen's interests and methods that worked for her so that she could find success, learn to speak and write and read, all those things, being both blind and deaf, with a lot of the finger spellings and those things. I'd say she's kind of, what in the modern day now we call differentiated instruction. She was kind of a key leader in that back then, just doing what she could to help Helen. So as we look through time, every era, every society has students with disabilities. And we're going to look specifically at American history here and how special education evolved. So we look here in those early years. Starting out, students with disabilities were very segregated. They were left in institutions and basically considered uneducable. So that was until parents of these children started speaking up. Due to that parental advocacy in 1910, the White House Conference on Children was held, and this kind of got the talk started about getting children identified and given an education, these children with disabilities. As we go into a little bit farther, in 1918, we started to see those compulsory education laws, where those state governments were looking at ensuring that students were getting an education. Even prior to that, some of the first states to require education were Massachusetts in 1852 and Vermont in 1867. So that was quite a few years before, nationally there were these education laws in 1918. They felt that to educate our students would maintain our democracy and be very important to the future of our country, although this excluded students with disabilities. They were not given any rights under these compulsory education laws. So then, as we go along, getting into the 1950s, which, really isn't all that long ago, we see a big movement in that parental advocacy. National organizations were born. We have the Association for Persons with Severe Handicaps, TASH. We have ARC, the CEC. All those education or those advocacy groups are being born and really pushing for the rights of students with disabilities to an education like typical students were getting. Then we move on to the civil rights movement, in that 50s and 60s. And we see this very landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education. It really set the precedence for civil rights in school policies, and particularly students with disabilities, and as well as looking at race. That's probably what it's most popularly known for with the school in Georgia, I believe. So here we look at that Brown versus the Board says that under constitutional rights, under that 14th Amendment, we were violating the rights of students under that equal protection laws. They did have the right to an education, and therefore giving that right to students with disabilities. So that's kind of that big movement right there in Brown versus Board of Education. As with looking at chapter 1, you see you have that circle where we have the litigation and the legislation and so on. So now moving into the 1970s, we talked a little bit about these two cases in chapter 1. In 1972, we see where that parent advocacy is born in these court cases. So we have Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Mills versus the Board of Education of D.C. In that Park case, students with cognitive disabilities were given the same right of education as their non-disabled peers. And then in the Mills case, students could not be excluded from school without due process. So giving parents a process to go through to make sure and ensure that their rights are given to the students with disabilities. Following these two cases in the next 2.5 years, there were 46 more rights to education cases. So you can see how that circle gets things moving, people talking. And um, as we go through here now, um, let's look at some of those later years into the present. So now we're looking at 1965, when we start to get some federal involvement in education. Um, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, was signed by Lyndon Johnson. And it was the first time the federal government provided funds to states to educate in certain groups of students. So it really gave states that extra support and help to educate. The problem is the students with disabilities were being included in the schools, but they were also still being very segregated. It was like still almost like the institutions, because they were, in classes with other students with disabilities, and didn't integrate a lot with the typical learning students. So part of the problem was people didn't know how to best teach them. So some of these federal grants helped to educate and train teachers on how to teach students with disabilities. So you can kind of start seeing the progress there. In 1966, we have the Education of the Handicapped Act. This is kind of where we start to see what IDA is today. So this EHA replaced the amendment to the ESEA and provided grants to states for pilot projects and technical assistance centers, and kind of that first freestanding law for special education. Again, giving them tools to work with these students. Then we move on in 1973, where we get the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, which you've maybe heard of. So this was our first federal civil rights law for people with disabilities, and it basically prohibited the discrimination against people, due to disability from agencies that received federal funds. So that would include a school. But the difference here with Section 504 is it goes the lifespan. It's not just for school-aged children. And we'll talk more specifically about Section 504 later, but definitely work with students that are on these accommodation plans as well. All right, then moving on to 1975. This is the big act here, Public Law 94-142. And this combined a Bill of Rights for students with disabilities, but it also gave some financial incentive for states to really take this idea on in teaching students with disabilities. This is where we see FAPE born, a free, appropriate public education for students ages 3 through 21. So this was a big, important bill here. And then we go on to the Handicapped Children's Protection Act, and we talked about this in chapter 1 too, where this was where attorney fees were coming up in that case of Smith versus Robinson. And if parents prevailed in a case, then they could have their attorney fees reimbursed. It also was the birthplace of what's known today as Part C, or that Birth to 3 program, and that early childhood involvement. So that was, just back in 1986. So now we move on to 1990, where now we have that Public Law 94-142 is now become IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And, we dedicate chapter 4, the whole chapter, to IDEA, but this is the heart of what you are going to be doing working as a special educator. So here, really focused in on using that people first language. I am just so passionate about this and really want to communicate that we always need to use people first language. And by people first language, we mean that we don't say, oh, that autistic child, is having difficulty with this task. Instead, we put the person first. We'd say the student with autism is having difficulty with that task. So always put the person first, not the disability. Working with some administrators this past winter in a course similar to this, I was, kind of surprised how that language didn't come as easily to them as I thought it would. So really watch, how you write and how you speak in meetings and such, and remember the person first. Along with person first language, we start to see transition planning becoming important when students are reaching that age, 16, planning for what happens after school. And another thing is we added some categories. They added the category of autism as well as traumatic brain injury. Now, in 1997, there were some amendments added to IDEA, and the focus here was increasing the quality of our instruction as special educators. There's also kind of the time when we look at No Child Left Behind in 2002 that really focused in on that accountability and those highly qualified teachers, all of those things that we've lived through, right? Then we move on to 2004, and we have again kind of changed the name of IDEA to IDEIA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So you can see the residual effects of No Child Left Behind with increasing the accountability for students with disability for the classroom, for the school, the district level. There were changes made to the IEP. There was more clarification of identifying students with specific learning disability, really looking at that highly qualified special education teacher, and looking at the rigor of the interventions being used and making sure that they were scientifically based research in those interventions that were being used with the students on a daily basis. So you can see kind of really up in the ante there. So, then that brings us to looking at 2015 and to the present. Here, our No Child Left Behind was recently reauthorized to the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESA, it's also referred to. After several years, this is kind of the renaming of that Elementary Secondary Education Act back in 1965. So, 50 years later, we're looking at reauthorizing this major piece of legislation. So what we looked here is, again, looking at those high academic standards, just as No Child Left Behind did. Want to make sure students are college and career ready. Taking a step back from those common core standards, they're no longer required. How do we assess standards? We need high quality preschools, really focusing on that early intervention, and also looking at mental and emotional behavioral health of students, which I'm pretty, as a school psychologist, pretty passionate about. That is so important, and what we're seeing in schools today, that is a big piece that we need to focus on that we maybe haven't had to before. Also looking at assessing students with disabilities on those national standardized tests, that only 1% of the students would take the alternate assessment. That's really started this last year, as well as looking at those English language learners and starting to, take those tests sooner, which is is tough. But it also goes with more funding for school improvement and working on that school climate and safety. So, the tough part of that is it doesn't always come with a lot of funding. But, states needed to submit their plan to the federal government by last September. And so it's kind of just getting our feet wet in this, but to see how it will eventually play out. So as you can kind of see here between, where we started in the early 1900s and, how parents have always, been the big push early in the history of special education. And then as we get more, court cases and legislation and how we keep improving and wanting to do better for students. So that gives you kind of a quick review of the history of special education, kind of where we come from. Place yourself in this timeline. When did you go to school, and what are your memories of special education when you were going to school? And that's part of our forum question for this week as well. So I placed myself, my memories of special education. So I was probably in elementary school in the 80s and high school in the 90s, early 90s. And I don't have a whole lot of memories of special education, but I always remember it as a separate thing. Like in elementary school, the teacher would come and take kids and they would go to a different room, and being like kids even are today, I always wanted to go too. Well, why don't I get to go? But my guess is that they were going to get their special education in a resource room. Now in high school, I remember there was this special room that students with more severe disabilities went to, and I believe from my memory it was called the LRE room, which, LRE stands for least restrictive environment. So, with it being a separate room, I'm not sure it was the least restrictive environment, but, that's kind of where we were at that time. That was, when IDEA was first being born. So, place yourself on this timeline, and what are your memories of special education as you went through school, and then how that compares to the history and how you can see how that fits together. So we will see you next, or I'll talk at you next, about IDEA. So thank you.